Some cartoons did not just entertain, they distorted reality, twisted faces, melted backgrounds, and pulled viewers into worlds that felt closer to nightmares than to family entertainment. Decades before psychedelic culture, animators were already breaking every visual rule and getting away with it. Audiences laughed, gasped, and sometimes left theaters confused about what they had just watched. These 15 surreal cartoons looked completely insane on purpose, and the stories behind them are stranger than the images themselves. Welcome to a tour through animation's most unhinged moments. 1. Bimbo's Initiation, 1931. Imagine a black and white cartoon dog being chased through underground tunnels by hooded cult members chanting for him to join their order. That actually happened in a 1931 theatrical short distributed by Paramount. Bimbo's Initiation, directed by Dave Fleischer, opens with the little dog falling through a sidewalk into a secret society that refuses to let him leave. Floors collapse, walls grow eyes, knives appear, and every escape becomes a new trap. The repeated question is simple and chilling: wanna be a member? Even today, animation historians describe this short as one of the most disturbing cartoons ever produced for general theatrical release. Its ending, where the cultists reveal themselves to be Betty Boop, is somehow even stranger than the chase. The pre-code Fleischer Studios was willing to put images on screen that no modern children's network would ever approve. The cartoon survives because it was preserved by collectors and archives. It remains one of animation's most uncomfortable masterpieces, and the strangeness was only beginning. 2. Swing You Sinners, 1930. A graveyard comes alive. Tombstones twist into mouths. Shadows develop personalities. Animals form a jazz choir of judgment. Swing You Sinners, also directed by Dave Fleischer, threw Bimbo into a churchyard nightmare where every object accused him of wrongdoing. The cartoon was released before the Hays Code began strictly enforcing decency rules in Hollywood, and Fleischer Studios took full advantage of that freedom. The animation feels less like a story and more like a fever dream set to music. Faces stretch impossibly. Backgrounds morph mid-frame. The rhythm pulses like a Harlem nightclub from 1930. Modern animators still study Swing You Sinners for its raw inventiveness, because nothing made today comes close to its unhinged spontaneity. It was theatrical entertainment, distributed widely, watched by everyday Americans. That fact alone is astonishing. The short is not famous for its plot, because there isn't really one. It is famous for refusing to behave like a cartoon, and it would not be the last time Fleischer Studios broke reality. 3. Minnie the Moocher, 1932. Cab Calloway dancing as a ghostly walrus in a haunted cave sounds like something invented yesterday, but it premiered in 1932 in a Betty Boop short produced by Fleischer Studios. Minnie the Moocher uses rotoscope animation, a process where animators trace over filmed human movement. Calloway himself was filmed performing his famous song, and his movements were translated into the walrus ghost that haunts Betty and Bimbo as they hide in a graveyard cave. Skeletons drink milk straight from skeleton cows. Ghosts hang themselves on phantom gallows for laughs. Spirits float through walls singing about heroin in lyrics that somehow made it past censorship. The cartoon opens with live-action footage of Calloway and his orchestra, then transitions into one of the strangest sequences in animation history. Audiences in 1932 had never seen anything like it. Today, the short is preserved as an important historical record of both early sound animation and the music of Cab Calloway. The boundary between cartoon and concert dissolved completely. 4. Snow White, 1933. Fleischer Studios did not adapt Snow White into a tidy fairy tale. They threw it into the underworld. In the 1933 Betty Boop version, the story collapses within minutes. Betty is frozen in a glass coffin. Coco the Clown transforms into a giant white ghost as he sings St. James Infirmary Blues, voiced and rotoscoped from Cab Calloway. Walls become living entities. The Wicked Queen becomes a literal dragon. The Magic Mirror talks back with the personality of a Harlem comedian. The Library of Congress added the short to the National Film Registry, recognizing it as one of the most significant pieces of early American animation. Animation historian Leonard Maltin once called it possibly the strangest cartoon ever produced by a major studio. The short runs only 7 minutes, but contains more visual invention than some entire features. Children watching it in 1933 must have left theaters wondering what they had just seen. Decades later, the answer is still complicated. Snow White was art disguised as cartoon. and Disney's own studio was about to try something far darker. 5. The Mad Doctor, 1933. Mickey Mouse does not always seem like a horror character, but in 1933, Walt Disney released The Mad Doctor, a short where Pluto is kidnapped by a deranged scientist who plans to surgically combine him with a chicken. Mickey rushes through a haunted castle filled with skeletons, dungeons, and operating tables that look more like medieval torture devices than medical equipment. The cartoon was so unsettling that several states banned it from theaters, and Ohio specifically rejected it under censorship laws of the era. Disney's reputation today is built on warmth, music, and storybook magic, which makes The Mad Doctor feel almost impossible. Yet there it is. In the official Disney filmography, a genuinely terrifying piece of theatrical animation released to mainstream audiences during the Great Depression, the short has survived in restored form and remains one of the darkest entries in Mickey's entire screen history. Walt Disney was once willing to take Mickey Mouse to genuinely scary places. Few people remember that today, but other studios were going even further into pure surrealism. 6. Balloon Land, 1935. Ub Iwerks, the legendary co-creator of Mickey Mouse, ran his own independent studio for a few years in the early 1930s. One of its most haunting creations was Balloon Land, also known as The Pincushion Man, released in 1935. The cartoon takes place in a kingdom where every person, animal, building, and object is made entirely of balloons. The villain is a hulking, dark figure covered in sewing pins who invades the kingdom with the simple, terrifying intention of popping everyone. The concept is brilliant and brutal in equal measure. Watching innocent balloon citizens flee a creature designed to destroy them with a single touch is unsettling even by modern standards. The animation itself is beautiful, with smooth color and lively design, but the premise lingers because it taps into something primal about vulnerability. Children watching in 1935 were essentially being told that the world could be punctured at any moment. Iwerks' short is rarely discussed today, yet it remains one of the most quietly disturbing concepts in Golden Age animation. 7. The Sunshine Makers, 1935. Van Buren Studios specialized in bizarre cartoons, but The Sunshine Makers may be its strangest. In this 1935 short, a tribe of cheerful gnomes lives on a sunlit hill, bottling sunshine in glass jugs, the way other people might bottle milk. Across the valley lives a tribe of grim, depressed gnomes who live in shadows and drink dark liquid that keeps them miserable. The two groups go to war. The cheerful gnomes use their bottled sunshine as ammunition, firing rays of light at the depressed gnomes, who are forcibly converted into happiness on impact. The visuals are bright, colorful, and deeply unsettling. The forced cheerfulness theme has been analyzed for decades by animation scholars and was once even adapted into Borden milk commercials in the 1940s because the premise was strange enough to sell dairy products. The short was preserved because it stood out so completely from the rest of the era. The Sunshine Makers is what happens when good intentions collide with surreal logic and the result still feels uncomfortable. 8. The Old Mill Pond, 1936. Hugh Harman directed The Old Mill Pond for MGM in 1936, and the short remains one of the most artistically beautiful and most controversial cartoons of the era. Set in a moonlit pond, the cartoon features frogs, reimagined as famous jazz musicians of the time, including caricatured versions of Louis Armstrong, Cab Calloway, Bill Robinson, and Fats Waller. The animation is fluid, the use of color stunning, and the music genuinely thrilling, but many of the caricatures rely on racial imagery that is widely considered offensive today, and the cartoon is often discussed alongside other censored 11-type controversies of the era. The surreal element comes from how completely the cartoon dissolves into pure music. Frogs sing, dance, leap, and morph in time with the orchestrations. There is almost no plot, only mood. For older viewers who grew up hearing these jazz legends, the cartoon is fascinating and uncomfortable in equal measure. It captured the energy of an entire musical era in animated form, but did so through imagery that history has rightly questioned. 9. Porky in Wackyland, 1938. Bob Clampett did not believe cartoons needed to make sense. In 1938, he proved it with Porky in Wackyland, a black and white Looney Tunes short for Warner Brothers. The premise is simple. Porky Pig travels to the wilds of Africa to capture the world's last dodo bird, who is reportedly worth a fortune. What Porky finds is a Salvador Dalí painting come to life. Trees walk, the sun rises by hand cranking itself, buildings appear out of nowhere, creatures defy biology, gravity, and any rule of logical animation. The dodo himself is a chaotic figure who teleports across the screen, plays drums on his own ribcage, and breaks the fourth wall. The Library of Congress added Porky and Wackyland to the National Film Registry, recognizing its cultural significance. Clampett's vision essentially predicted decades of experimental animation, from Yellow Submarine to Adventure Time. The short proved that mainstream studio animation could be genuinely avant-garde while still being funny. Wackyland was not a mistake. It was a manifesto disguised as a Porky Pig cartoon. 10. Pink Elephants on Parade, 1941. Disney rarely loses control of itself, but in Dumbo, the studio briefly went somewhere remarkable. After accidentally drinking champagne, Dumbo and his mouse friend begin to hallucinate. What follows is Pink Elephants on Parade, a sequence so visually unhinged that it still inspires animators today. Elephants morph into shapes that defy logic, breaking apart and reassembling into vehicles, instruments, and abstract patterns. The colors shift constantly. The music speeds up and slows down without warning. There is no real story inside the sequence, only experience. The scene runs roughly 4 minutes, but it has become more iconic than most of the film around it. Critics have analyzed Pink Elephants on Parade as a milestone in surrealist animation, comparing it to fine art rather than family entertainment. Disney never made anything quite like it again. The sequence stands as proof that even a studio known for storybook safety was willing to take audiences into genuinely strange territory. It remains one of the most discussed animated sequences ever produced in the United States. 11. The Dover Boys at Pimento University, 1942. Chuck Jones almost lost his job over this one. The Dover Boys at Pimento University, released by Warner Brothers in 1942, looked nothing like the studio's other cartoons. Jones used limited animation, exaggerated poses, smear frames, and minimal in-between drawings to create a stylized, almost modernist visual experience. The plot is a parody of the Rover Boys novels, with 3 impossibly virtuous brothers competing for the affection of a young woman who keeps getting kidnapped by an outrageous villain named Dan. Backslide. Studio executives reportedly disliked the experimental style so much that Jones was nearly fired. But the short went on to influence generations of animators, including the founders of UPA, the team behind Ren and Stimpy, and the entire smear animation aesthetic that defined television cartoons for decades. The Library of Congress added Dover Boys to the National Film Registry in 2007, recognizing its lasting impact. What once looked like a mistake now looks like a revolution. Chuck Jones had quietly invented modern animation inside what seemed like a college parody. 12. Tinpan Alley Cats, 1943. Bob Clampett returned to surreal territory in 1943 with Tinpan Alley Cats. The short features a cat character clearly modeled on Fats Waller, who walks into a Harlem-style jazz club and is dragged into a bizarre, dreamlike journey. The animation reuses imagery from Porky and Wackyland, blending it with new sequences of musical chaos, melting environments, and surreal transformations. The cartoon is controversial today because of its racial caricatures, which reflect the harmful imagery common in Warner Brothers shorts of the era. It is one of the cartoons not officially released by Warner Brothers for home video due to those concerns. Still, animation historians acknowledge Tinpan Alley Cats as one of the wildest visual experiments of the 1940s. Clampett's willingness to push imagery into total surrealism remained unmatched in the studio. The cartoon is fascinating and deeply uncomfortable, an example of how brilliant animation and offensive content sometimes existed inside the same 6-minute reel. Surreal cartoons did not always reflect surreal beauty. Sometimes they reflected surreal blindness. 13. The Telltale Heart, 1953. UPA was already changing American animation when it decided to adapt Edgar Allan Poe. In 1953, the studio released The Telltale Heart, a deeply unsettling short narrated by James Mason. There is no comedy, no music for relief, and no traditional cartoon characters. Instead, the screen is filled with paranoid abstract imagery, jagged shapes, distorted shadows, and color schemes designed to evoke madness. The narrator's voice slowly unravels as he describes a murder he has committed, and the heartbeat he believes still echoes beneath the floorboards. The short was so disturbing for its time that it became the first American cartoon ever given an X rating in the United Kingdom, meaning children were not allowed to watch it. It received an Academy Award nomination for Best Animated Short Film in 1954. UPA proved that animation could be genuine literary horror, not just family entertainment. The Telltale Heart still feels uncomfortable today. The studio that gave America Mr. Magoo also gave it one of the most haunting cartoons ever produced. 14. Rudy Toot, 1951. UPA was a studio of contradictions. It produced cheerful Mr. Magoo shorts, then released cartoons that pushed the medium into adult, modernist territory. Rudy Toot, directed by John Hubley in 1951, is one of those bolder works. The short retells the folk song Frankie and Johnny as an animated courtroom drama, with characters drawn in flat, stylized shapes and movements based on choreography by dancer Olga Lunik. There is no traditional cartoon humor. Instead, the story unfolds as a jazz-infused musical about a woman on trial for shooting her unfaithful lover. The visual style is striking, almost like a modern painting in motion. The cartoon won the Grand Prix at the Venice Film Festival's animation category and received an Academy Award nomination. American audiences in 1951 had rarely seen anything like it. Rudy Toot helped prove that animation could mature into something closer to live-action drama or fine art, without losing its sense of rhythm. UPA was telling Hollywood that cartoons did not have to look like cartoons anymore. 15. Toot, Whistle, Plunk and Boom, 1953. Walt Disney himself once admitted that this short looked nothing like Disney. Toot, Whistle, Plunk and Boom, directed by Ward Kimball in 1953, was the studio's first cartoon produced in CinemaScope and its first to fully embrace the flat, modernist style that UPA had pioneered. The short explains the history of musical instruments, using bright colors, geometric shapes, and exaggerated character designs that bore no resemblance to Mickey Mouse or Snow White. Critics were surprised, audiences were delighted, and the Academy Awards gave it the Oscar for Best Animated Short Film that year. The short signaled a major shift inside Disney itself, acknowledging that the realistic, fully animated style the studio had perfected was no longer the only valid path. Toot, Whistle, Plunk and Boom feels almost mid-century modern in design, the kind of cartoon that could hang in a museum next to Eames furniture. For a brief moment, even Disney accepted that animation could look completely different. Then the studio returned to its safer, more familiar style. These 15 cartoons proved that animation never had to behave. From pre-code Fleischer nightmares to UPA's modernist experiments, American studios once dared to be strange, dark, and genuinely artistic. The strangest cartoons were not mistakes, they were milestones. And the more we forget them, the more important it becomes to remember that animation history is far weirder, bolder, and more fascinating than most viewers ever realized.